a skill that you'd like to get better at performing. Maybe you'd like to improve your tennis game or your golf game. Or maybe you'd like to learn a foreign language or get better at playing the piano. Now, let me ask you, how can you get better at that skill? Specifically, how would you practice? And more importantly, how should you practice? For example, should the aspiring tennis player practice by hitting a lot of forehands in a row and then hitting a lot of backhands in a row? Or would it be better to intermix forehands and backhands like you would in a match? Should the musician practice for a long time all at once, or practice in multiple sessions for shorter periods of time? Is it better for a math student to try to solve problems herself, or to watch an expert show her the right way to solve them? Vince Lombardi famously said, "Practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect." But what constitutes perfect practice? Well, scientists have actually been investigating this question for decades, and their findings have important implications for how to get the most out of our practice. Unfortunately, most people are unaware of this research. In fact, the approaches to training that are used by most coaches today are based largely on intuition and trial and error, rather than on sound scientific evidence. And as we'll see, many of our intuitions about effective practice may not just be wrong, they may actually be undermining our improvement. Now, in this talk, I'll discuss 3 key ideas about practice that have been scientifically demonstrated to be effective in the acquisition and long-term retention of skills. These ideas can be remembered with the acronym SCORE, which stands for Space, Challenge, and Randomize. The most effective way to score and become more of an expert in some domain is to space, challenge, and randomize in your practice. Now, before I explain these 3 ideas in more detail, I need to dispel one very common misconception about effective practice. Many people believe that whatever method of practice leads to the most immediate improvement must be the most effective method. For instance, the tennis player who repeatedly hits cross-court forehand after cross-court forehand during practice may begin to get in a groove with that shot and quickly improve her ability to hit it consistently and accurately. Similarly, the pianist who plays scales over and over may get very fluid at playing those scales and feel like he's making real progress. Unfortunately, as tennis players and pianists the world over can attest, the confidence that one feels during practice doesn't always translate into better performance during a match or a concert. But why not? Well, to understand the reason, it's important to distinguish long-term learning from short-term performance. In most cases, the goal of practice is long-term learning, that is, improvement that lasts and that will be apparent in any context. The tennis player on the practice court would like to see a lasting improvement in her overall game. That's apparent whether she plays on hard court or clay, and no matter what opponent she faces. And the pianist would like to see a general improvement in playing his instrument that can be seen regardless of the piece that he's playing. However, we often choose practice methods based not on how much they improve our long-term learning, but rather based on how much they improve our short-term performance. That is, our ability to perform the skill in the context of the current practice session itself. For example, it's much easier to groove a tennis swing when repeatedly hitting the same shot rather than intermixing shots. And so short-term performance during the practice session itself will likely be better. Likewise, it's easier to see improvement when playing scales or practicing a short musical excerpt over and over. than it is when switching between pieces. Now, it's only natural to assume that if our short-term performance is getting better, then our method of practice must be paying off, and our long-term learning will also be maximized. But it turns out that our intuition is wrong. In fact, training methods that are most effective for long-term learning tend to introduce difficulties during practice that actually make short-term performance worse. Doctors Dominic Simon and Robert Bjork performed an experiment at UCLA that illustrates the point. They asked people to learn 3 different sequences of key presses on the number pad of a keyboard. Now, half the participants practiced one sequence over and over before moving on to another sequence. The other half practiced one of the sequences once, and then practiced a different sequence once, and so on, in an unpredictable random order. Both groups returned the next day and were tested again to assess their longer-term learning. Now, predictably, during the practice session, people who got to practice each sequence over and over in separate blocks did better than people who practiced the sequences in random order. The people in the blocked condition also predicted that they would continue to do well when tested the next day. But they were wrong. In fact, the people who practiced the sequences in unpredictable order did much better the following day. Now, there are 2 important lessons we can draw from this study. First, long-term learning can be significantly improved by introducing changes that actually make short-term performance harder rather than easier. Dr. Bjork refers to these kinds of changes as desirable difficulties. Coaches of famous athletes occasionally intentionally introduce desirable difficulties into their athletes' practice. For example, Tiger Woods' father often made loud noises while Tiger was trying to hit golf shots during practice, so that he would be better at ignoring distractions during competition. Likewise, Olympic swimmer Michael Phelps' coach once intentionally cracked his goggles so that Phelps would be prepared to swim by counting strokes if his goggles ever failed in a real competition. And that experience with difficulty paid off when Phelps' goggles actually did fail during a race in the 2008 Olympics. He nevertheless went on to win gold by counting strokes as he had practiced, despite not being able to see. A second lesson that we can draw from Simon and Bjork's study is that our intuitions about which training method will be the most effective for long-term learning are not reliable. Most people assume that a training method that leads to rapid improvement during training will also lead to lasting improvements, and they therefore gravitate towards such methods. Unfortunately, those methods typically don't actually maximize long-term learning. So, if our intuitions about effective practice are wrong, how should we practice? Well, let's return to the 3 key ideas about practice that have actually been scientifically demonstrated to be effective. Again, these ideas are summarized in the acronym SCORE, which stands for Space, Challenge, and Randomize. And each of these ideas can be seen as a kind of desirable difficulty. That is, they each make short-term performance harder, but that short-term difficulty is actually desirable because it leads to better long-term learning. Let's begin by talking about the S in SCORE, which stands for space. To maximize long-term learning, practice should be spaced out over time, distributed over time, rather than crammed into a short period. For example, consider 2 musicians who spend a total of 5 hours working on a new piece of music. Musician A practices an hour a day for 5 days, while musician B practices for 5 straight hours on a single day. Student A, who spaced out the study, will typically learn the piece better than student B, even though they practiced for the same amount of time. Carol Ann Moulton and a number of colleagues at the University of Toronto demonstrated the advantages of spaced practice in people training to be surgeons. 38 surgical residents received 4 training sessions on a specific type of microscopic surgery that required connecting very small blood vessels together. Now, half the residents received all the training in one day, which was the standard approach used in the residency program. The other half of the residents received one training session each week for 4 consecutive weeks. So, both groups received the same amount of training, but one group's training was spaced while the other group's training was not. Now, 1 month after the final training session, all the residents were asked to perform the surgery on a live rat while experts who didn't know about the experiment observed. The residents whose training was spaced performed much better. They all completed the surgery successfully, while some of the residents in the other group didn't. Furthermore, their surgically repaired blood vessels were more stable, and the experts rated their performance as being significantly better. So why would spacing the training help? Well, there are a couple of potential reasons. One idea is that people are more engaged and attentive after a delay. I mean, if you've just spent the past 2 hours practicing your golf putting, it might be tough to remain focused for another hour of the same kind of work. But if you take a break and space your practice, then you can often return more energized and be more productive in your third hour. Another reason spacing might help is that practicing a skill at different times can make it less dependent on any specific practice context. For instance, suppose you're hitting golf balls. In one practice session, the wind is blowing into your face, and hitting the ball lower leads to better results because it keeps the ball below the wind. But then, suppose you take a break, the wind shifts, and now it's with you during your next practice session. Now, hitting the ball higher might lead to better results because the ball can ride the wind. In this case, spacing your practice helped you learn to hit shots in 2 different types of conditions, both of which you're going to encounter when playing real rounds of golf. The bottom line for us is that we should space our practice to maximize long-term learning. For instance, athletes would benefit more from practicing for 30 minutes every day than they would from practicing for 4 hours once a week. And the musician who practices her instrument for a little while every day will typically do better than the one who crams all of her practice into a few marathon sessions that happen less frequently. Okay, that's spacing. The second idea for effective practice corresponds to the C in SCORE, which stands for challenge. Research suggests that your practice will be more effective if you deliberately challenge yourself. If you can identify specific challenging areas to work on, set specific goals within those areas that are difficult but not impossible to achieve, and then systematically work to achieve those goals. Then you'll improve faster than if you spend the same amount of time practicing without challenging yourself. One study that illustrates the benefits of deliberately challenging yourself was conducted by Nina Keith and Anders Ericsson at Florida State University. They recruited 60 university students who had several years of experience typing. And they gave them all a bunch of typing tasks. They measured how quickly they could perform simple perceptual and motor tasks, and they interviewed them to find out how they learned to type. And they reported 2 interesting results. First of all, believe it or not, perceptual and motor processing speed did not make a difference. You might expect that the people who were really fast at perceiving visual stimuli or who could press a button very rapidly would have a significant advantage and would be the fastest typists. But they weren't. In fact, perceptual and motor processing speed did not correlate with typing speed at all. Second, they found that what really mattered was deliberate challenging training. Specifically, the fastest typists had two common characteristics. For one thing, they had taken a formal typing class that included deliberate typing goals, such as attaining a certain speed or accuracy level by performing specific drills. And the second characteristic of the fast typists was that they challenged themselves to type as fast as possible during their daily typing tasks. Neither characteristic alone was sufficient to identify the fast typists. That is, attending a typing class didn't help the people who weren't challenging themselves to type as fast as possible, and trying to type as fast as possible only helped people who were given specific, deliberate goals to work on. The take-home message for us is clear. If you want to get better at a sport, or an instrument, or a foreign language, or any other complex skill, then you need to be systematic and deliberate in the way that you practice. Rather than practicing things that you're already good at, you want to deliberately challenge yourself and stretch your abilities when you practice. Take golf as an example. Now, golf is a multifaceted activity that involves many component skills. You need to be able to hit full shots with your woods and irons. You need to be able to hit shorter pitch shots over obstacles like sand traps. You need to be able to putt in a desired direction and with a specific speed. You need to be able to chip the ball close to the hole from just off the green, and so on. Now, weaknesses in any of these sub-skills will ultimately hurt your score. And yet, the vast majority of amateur golfers do very little to identify and address the weaknesses in their game. For most golfers, practice consists of going to the driving range and hitting a bucket of balls. The main goal is typically to hit the ball solidly and as far as possible. Many golfers don't even pick out a specific target to aim for at the range. A better approach would be to identify specific areas of your game that are costing you the most strokes, and then to deliberately work on those areas with challenging drills. If putting is costing you a lot of strokes, then work on putting drills that have specific challenging goals. You could see how many consecutive 4-foot putts you can make in a row, and then repeatedly try to break your record. If chipping is the problem, then you could identify a 3-foot circle around the hole and see how many chips out of 10 you can get inside that circle. If you're having trouble hitting full shots with your irons, then by all means, go to the driving range. But when you're there, identify a specific goal that you want to achieve, like hitting a specific practice green a certain number of times. If two players spend exactly the same amount of time practicing, but one of them adopts this kind of deliberate, challenging approach, while the other just hits balls at the range, I can virtually guarantee who's going to improve faster. Okay, now we began by talking about the importance of spacing your practice over time rather than cramming. Then we talked about the importance of repeatedly challenging yourself with deliberate goals rather than just practicing for practice sake. Now let's turn to the R in SCORE, which stands for randomizing your practice. Most complex skills involve multiple parts, each of which must be mastered. For example, tennis requires being able to hit forehands, backhands, volleys, and overheads. Learning a foreign language requires learning tens of thousands of different words. And algebra requires the ability to isolate variables and to graph functions, among many other skills. Random practice refers to mixing the practice of different parts of a skill, rather than practicing each part separately. For instance, remember the experiment on learning sequences of key presses on a number pad? The group that practiced the sequences in an unpredictable order was using a random practice schedule. So after practicing one sequence, they would practice a different one in a completely random order. The other group's practice was blocked rather than being random. That is, they practiced a single sequence over and over before switching to another sequence and practicing that one over and over. Now, do you remember the results? Although the short-term performance of the group that used random practice was worse, the next day they performed much better. So, if your goal is long-term learning rather than short-term performance, random practice is better than blocked practice. Now, many people find this result counterintuitive. After all, isn't it better to break down a complex skill into separate parts and practice each part separately without interference from all the other parts? Well, although that is a very common way to practice, and although it certainly does improve short-term performance, random practice is better for long-term learning. One potential explanation for why is that when you actually have to perform the real skill later on, you'll typically have to perform all the subparts in an unpredictable order. Using random practice therefore better prepares you for the real execution of the skill. For example, when playing in a real tennis match, you'll be forced to intermix forehands and backhands in an unpredictable order. And it turns out that it's better to practice that way too. As athletes often say, you should practice the way you play. In addition to randomizing the order of practice, it's also helpful to randomize the conditions of your practice. If you always practice under the same predictable conditions, then your learning can become strongly tied to those conditions. For instance, if you always hit golf balls at the same practice range or practice on the same piano, then you may limit the generality of your learning. When it comes time to use those skills in a real competition or at an actual recital, you could find that you haven't mastered them as well as you thought you had. Doctors Kerr and Bruth at the University of Ottawa conducted a study that illustrates the benefits of randomizing practice conditions. Two groups of children practiced tossing bean bags at a target. Now, half the children always tossed to a target that was 3 feet away. But the other half of the children tossed to targets that varied in distance and were never 3 feet away. After training, both groups of children tossed beanbags at the 3-foot target. Now, as incredible as it sounds, the children who practiced at varying distances actually performed better than the children who had trained exclusively at the 3-foot distance. And remember, the children in the variable distance condition never practiced at 3 feet, while the children in the constant distance condition always did. So clearly, randomizing your practice can be a very powerful approach. The implications for you and me as we try to learn new skills should be pretty clear. We should mix up our practice rather than working on an isolated part of the skill for an extended period of time. The tennis player should consider intermixing forehands and backhands during practice. The golfer might want to switch clubs after every shot or two when practicing at the driving range. Likewise, the musician might want to practice different pieces during each practice session, rather than just focusing on one. Well, we've now discussed 3 of the most important principles of effective practice, which can be summarized in the acronym SCORE: space, challenge, and randomize. These are all examples of what we refer to as desirable difficulties. Although they introduce difficulties into your practice session and may therefore actually make short-term performance worse, they're desirable difficulties because they tend to make long-term learning better. Now, before we finish today's lecture, I want to point out a few important qualifications on these recommendations. First, it's important to recognize that not all difficulties are desirable. In particular, the level of difficulty needs to match the ability of the learner. There's nothing wrong with novice tennis players practicing forehand after forehand while they try to learn the basics of the grip and swing. Likewise, although it's fine for an intermediate golfer to practice hitting a large green from 100 yards away, that's probably not challenging enough to stretch a professional golfer. The point is that people at every skill level need to introduce difficulties during practice that are challenging but also manageable. Likewise, spacing and randomizing can also be taken too far. For instance, spacing becomes ineffective if the delay between practice sessions is so long that the learners have forgotten what they previously learned. And although randomizing practice conditions is helpful, there's no need to include conditions that you would never actually encounter in real life. For example, although it's helpful for a basketball player to practice shooting from a variety of different distances, there's no need for the player to practice shots from 200 feet. Finally, it's important to realize that the goal is not always long-term learning. Sometimes the goal is short-term performance. For instance, golfers who are warming up before an important round are more worried about finding a groove with their swing rather than trying to improve in the long term. Likewise, the musician who's preparing for a recital tomorrow is more worried about short-term performance than long-term learning. And in those kinds of cases, spacing and random practice may not be the ideal way to prepare. Well, let's conclude today's lecture by giving you a little test to see how much you can remember. Can you remember the acronym that summarized the three main principles of effective practice? It was SCORE. And do you remember what the C in SCORE stands for? That was challenge. How about the S? That was space. And finally, how about the R? That stands for randomize. Now, you may have noticed that the design of this lecture actually applied to these very principles. For example, the discussion of the principles was spaced out in time. Each was introduced near the beginning of the lecture, then there was a delay before we returned to discuss each in more detail, and finally there was another delay before we returned to each one again in this conclusion. There were also a few places where I challenged your ability to remember the information, just like now when I asked you to remember the acronym and what it stood for. Finally, although the overall organization of the lecture was highly structured to make it easier to understand, I asked you about the acronym letters in a randomized order. Well, I hope you'll try applying these principles in your own practice. Although they may seem counterintuitive, and although they will probably make your practice more difficult, research has shown us again and again that they really do work. So, if your goal is long-term learning, then remember to space, challenge, and randomize your practice. Okay, well, in this lecture, we focused on how to optimize our learning of skills. But sometimes we'd be better off not learning because what we're learning is actually harmful. And in our next lecture, we'll talk about a situation in which learning can be extremely harmful, namely addiction. As we'll see, all addictions, whether it's to drugs, alcohol, or behaviors like gambling, share a lot of commonalities. They all involve external rewards hijacking the brain's natural reward circuits in order to make the victim crave a behavior that could cost them everything: their jobs, their families, even their lives. But at its core, addiction is a learned behavior. So how can learning go so terribly wrong? And is there anything we can do about it based on what we know about how learning works? Those are the questions that we'll address next time.